Up next, I'd really like to ask Martina Beck from British Columbia's Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship, speaking about watercraft inspections all across the Pennoir region. Thank you, Martina.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to present here today. I want to thank Penmore and the Government of Saskatchewan for the opportunity to be here in person. I really value these opportunities to connect and engage in person. It's really valuable for strengthening our coordinated efforts. Have to admit, I thought I was going to be able to avoid a true winter experience. Victoria is where I'm coming from, where we managed to escape snow this year. I'm not to brag, but the cherry blossoms are in full bloom there. But I'm notoriously known for every time I travel to the prairies, I bring full winter conditions. Last time I was in Manitoba, it was minus 50. So you're welcome. Whether you want to blame or thank me for this freak snowstorm, which I also experienced traveling through Calgary on my way here. So, but yeah, I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I have the honor of kicking things off on what is a very impressive and fantastic agenda with a lot of really great presentations to follow. So I'm going to do my best to kind of set the stage, but you're going to hear a lot of really great presentations throughout the day. And I'm coming up here wearing two hats, not only as representative for the British Columbia program, but also as the technical co-chair for the Pennoir Invasive Species Working Group. And I do really want to acknowledge my co-chair, Justin Bush, from the state of Washington, who unfortunately couldn't be here in person. So I'm giving this as a joint presentation, but it was very much collaborative between the two of us. And so it's been mentioned already, and you're going to hear it as a very common theme throughout the day, is really focusing on our coordination and prevention efforts. I'm going to focus mostly on watercraft inspection, but really touch on some other key areas of work that are happening, also linked to response preparedness and readiness, and we're going to hear some examples of that throughout the day as well. I'm also the first person of the day testing the technology. As it's on. There we go. And so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about a recent resolution that was approved through Pennoir on aquatic invasive species and highlight some examples of some of those commitments and work that's happening across the region that supports this recent resolution that was approved. And really focusing on some of these regional coordination efforts and how we're working collectively together across our networks and our programs. Are you just going to advance for me? Is that? Okay. Oh. So we know that the overland movement of watercraft is a primary mechanism for spread of not only invasive mussels, but other aquatic invasive species. Oh, apologies. I guess we're gonna, so coming to the resolution first to start. So in October of 2025, the Pennoir Executive Committee approved a resolution to renew our commitments towards aquatic invasive species prevention, with a key focus being that invasive mussels remains our top collective aquatic invasive species priority across the region. And really, the commitments center around a lot of existing work that's happening, renewing, looking at our governments to prioritize and strengthen not only our prevention, but our response kind of investments, and exploring, looking at continuing to encourage the use of our existing authorities, and also opportunities to increase technical and financial support towards our efforts. For today's presentation, I'm going to focus really on kind of items number 4 and 5, which is really around the existing coordination efforts that are happening in the Pennoir region and how we can continue to strengthen existing partnerships, but also looking at new sectors and new areas that could be impacted. We have a lot of work that's been done to highlight and showcase what those risks are to some key sectors, but how do we start to expand looking at where it may impact other sectors that we haven't necessarily thought about yet. Next slide. So looking at the overland movement of watercraft, we know this is the primary mechanism of spread for invasive mussels and other aquatic invasive species. This map shows just from 1 year where our BC provincial program saw how far and wide boats travel between jurisdictions. And I think we're going to hear some more specific examples later today about distances that boaters travel with their boats. And so really what this shows is we see continued movement of watercraft, and whether that's through watercraft or equipment or continuing to see expansions of trade, we're seeing that this can have unintended consequences of aquatic invasive species being transported. And how do we continue to work to support the movement but not have those unintended consequences of the risks of AIS spread? Next slide. So we know that there's growing risks to the Penmore region, and we see this through that increased movement. The map on the left shows the change in rate of spread of zebra and quagga mussels starting from back in the mid-1980s when they were first introduced into the Great Lakes, and how we see that further movement west and how that sort of line of defense is unfortunately continuing to move further west, and how do we continue to help mitigate that risk of further spread. And also we're facing new and emerging threats. Some may not be aware, but we're now also dealing with a new species of invasive mussels. So in 2024, there was the first detection of the golden mussel in North America in California. You can see the map on the right here shows where golden mussels have been detected since that first detection in 2024. So they're seeing in a quite high rate of spread from the original point of introduction in 2024. Golden mussel poses an likely equally great risk to the Penmore region as zebra and quagga mussels. It's a very similar species to zebra and quagga mussels in terms of its characteristics. It has that same ability to be spread by the overland movement of watercraft, and even some characteristics that could allow it to survive in even broader range of conditions than zebra and quagga mussels. So with this new emerging threat, what it also showed is that it was introduced into a port in California. It's a species that can survive in some brackish waters. So it also brought forward a pathway that, well, is known, kind of brought it more front and center when we're looking at things like transcontinental shipping and how that can also bring aquatic invasive species. So we're facing new potential species, but also looking at what are these pathways that we need to be thinking about across the region. Next slide. And as we look, I think we're all familiar with the potential economic risks associated with invasive mussels. So an example was in 2015, an assessment was done looking at impacts, mitigation costs to hydro infrastructure within the Penmore region, which in 2015 was estimated at around 500 million. Of course, likely since then, that number has increased. And we know that there's going to be impacts to other sectors and other areas as well. As an example, in British Columbia, we did an update to our economic assessment in 2023, which looked across not only hydropower, but also looking at impacts to agriculture irrigation, looking at municipal water supply, tourism, property value. And that updated estimate ranged from 64 million to 129 million annually if mussels were to be introduced, but doesn't factor in, as an example, what that cost might look like if we also bring in a species like the golden mussel. And so we know that these impacts can span to other sectors as well. Next slide. So I mentioned there's shipping, but there's also recreation and fisheries. There's also looking at raw water infrastructure. I mentioned, of course, irrigation. I know of particular concern here in Saskatchewan. And so how these, as we see, of course, continued movement of commodities and with trade, and again, how we want to try to mitigate the risks associated with the potential movement of AIS and how we mitigate those potential costs. And moving to the next slide. And so what is being done across the region? And so Really, I think if anything, this is probably one of the most important slides to take away from my presentation is this really highlights that work is happening across multiple different regions, and regions can have different geographical boundaries, but we know that invasive species don't respect borders. They don't respect jurisdictional boundaries. And so what all these different regions have, whether it's through the Columbia River Basin, 100th Meridian Initiative, through Penwar, through the Western Regional Panel, on aquatic nuisance species. We also have a Western Canadian invasive species coordination group. All of these different groups and different regional approaches have a common goal and a lot of common methods and messaging, which was referenced before. We'll be talking a lot about today, things like clean, drain, dry, pull the plug. We're all working from a common voice and a common goal, which is to mitigate the risk of the movement of aquatic invasive species, and really working across our collective networks to strengthen not only the work within our jurisdictions to protect each of our own natural resources, but how we collectively work together to strengthen those efforts. Next slide. And I mentioned, we're working from a common message, and that's really focused around the goal of clean, drain, dry, whether it's for invasive mussels or other high-risk aquatic invasive species. Our collective common messaging is really there to strengthen the tools to achieve that. And we'll be talking about various different examples of some of those tools that are being used and how we can look to explore new tools to help achieve these common goals and share this common messaging, and how we also look to translate the messaging to our different kind of communities and understand how it can impact them as whether it's recreationists, water users, different industries, how the practices that they take can have important impacts to mitigate the risk. Next slide. So this is where taking a really multi-pronged approach is important. So we're going to be focusing a lot on watercraft inspections today, but there's really a sort of taking a multiple tools in the toolbox approach. So we'll also be talking about the importance of not only watercraft inspection, but the importance of early detection monitoring. We are seeing firsthand the roles that canines can play in outreach and education and different inspection tools. And so we really want to be taking that kind of multifaceted approach. And we're going to hear some great examples of how some of these tools are being implemented in different ways, and how we also build and learn from each other in terms of lessons learned. But really, there's some great work that's been done now for, in some cases, several decades, and we're really building and learning from all those efforts. Next slide. So I brought the map up again, just because I really want to, this map really highlights the collective efforts. So those points on the map are all the inspection stations that are operating across Western Canada and the US. And it's through our individual programs that we've built a collective network. We commonly in BC refer to it as a perimeter defense approach. We're always, as an BC being often an end destination for a lot of boats that are moving east to west, we've really benefited from this network of programs. We say it's a multi-layer approach where it's not just the work that BC is doing at our inspection stations, but we hugely benefit from receiving the notifications, whether it's from Montana, Saskatchewan, Idaho. It was actually data from Idaho's inspection stations that was shared with us before our program started that helped us get the information to say this is a risk to BC, because they were intercepting boats coming to BC, and it showed the importance of the risk to British Columbia and how we got our program started back in 2015. So there's really huge value and a lot of work that's being done, not only with within our own provinces and states, but as part of this larger network. We're all working off of a standard inspection and decontamination protocol. We are creating opportunities to join each other's inspection training that happens annually. So we've benefited from doing site visits at roadside inspection stations together, collectively learning from each other and sharing information, and also sharing feedback and lessons learned. That's a huge part. When we did start our program in 2015, Idaho and other jurisdictions had been running for several years. And so we didn't have to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. So there's a lot that we can continue to learn from. Next slide. And in terms of some of that ongoing inspection and coordination, some specific examples of where we've been working over more recent years to look at how we can target different specific pathways for watercraft movement. As an example, we have been working, and it was mentioned earlier, the work with Canadian Border Services agencies. So the Western provinces have been working with our federal border services to be receiving notifications of watercraft. We're going to hear some data and updates from work that's been happening at one of the port of entries in Manitoba. This work continues in terms of working across both our provincial borders, but also our international Canada-US borders, and continuing to build those relationships. And also work that started out of the US, out of the Western US, through the Call Before You Haul program. And what this is focused on targeting working specifically with the commercial hauler industry. So we do see boats coming from being commercially transported, and trying to work with that sector to bring awareness about our programs. These haulers are, of course, typically traveling between multiple provinces and states. They're going to be traveling through inspection stations across multiple programs, wanting them to understand the rules and requirements, but also working with them to receive advance notification. One of the key challenges with commercially transported boats is that they're often large, they're on flatbed trailers. You can't actually fully inspect and decontaminate them while they're in transit. So we need to take the steps to address those once they reach the end destination. And so how can we work with that kind of sector to find a way to work together and address it in a kind of help streamline the process, but also for them to be aware of the importance of still needing to stop at all our inspection stations. And actually, an interesting example that we encountered in Canada several years ago, next slide, in 2022, there was quite a unique situation example where we had a barge. Actually, it wasn't watercraft. So when we're talking about watercraft inspections, we're not only talking about boats, but we're also talking about different types of equipment that can be moved. And in this case, it was actually a barge that was so large it was being transported in two separate segments. It was going from the Great Lakes. It was destined for British Columbia. Specifically, it was being moved to support, I believe, dredging work in the Fraser River. And it was planned to be launched directly from the trailers into the Fraser River. And thanks to our collective programs, it was first intercepted in Manitoba. And through our notification process, the subsequent Western provinces were notified, and BC was notified such that, and this is a common situation that we have with commercially transported boats, is that we need to make the arrangement to conduct the inspection and, if necessary, decontamination at the destination. But often when they're commercially transported, we need to arrange them being put on blocks. They need to be at a specific site where it's safe to decontaminate. So we are able to make those arrangements, find a specific site that could accommodate such large equipment. We actually had to deploy extra crews to come into the Lower Mainland, where it took 2 full days to decontaminate these barges because they were so heavily fouled. We don't typically actually see boats this fouled coming through our stations. We're typically only seeing a small number of mussels when they're being intercepted. So this is quite unique in that sense. We did actually get confirmation through lab testing in this case that they were actually still live quagga mussels on these barges. So certainly that immediate risk if they were to be deployed, but it really showed the strength and success of having this perimeter defense, of having that advance notification and working together to make those arrangements. Since then, we've been working with the companies that are moving equipment for this dredging. They are now notifying us in advance. And we have work also going on with, for example, watercraft manufacturers to make sure that we know what their testing procedures are for new boats. We would assume that new boats are low risk, but in fact, some jurisdictions, they're actually being manufactured in places where there's mussel positive waters, and they actually will often deploy those watercraft into infested waters to test them. And where there's risk is for boats that say have ballast waters, and they test the ballast waters, and we want to make sure that they're properly treated before they're transported. So even new boats can potentially have a risk, but developing protocols to make sure that those testing procedures are low risk. So again, these are examples of how we're trying to work with industry as well to find solutions and find ways to streamline the process, because we do want to work with them, because we know the support from these industries is really critical to be successful in our measures. And so next slide. And also, there's work being done to explore how we can look at different ways to deliver our programs. For us in BC, we just had our 10-year anniversary of running our program last year. In other jurisdictions, they've been operating for a few decades now. And so how do we reflect back on how we've been approaching delivering the programs, and what are some new ways that we can explore that? I think we'll be hearing from Tom Wolfe about some ways that they've been expanding partnerships to deliver their program, and highlighting some of those examples. Also looking at mandatory inspection requirements, where Montana is also an example of where that's being implemented, but also looking at different ways for boat delivery and ways to help fund programs. Certainly long-term stable funding for prevention programs is really critical, but can be an ongoing challenge in terms of having that stable funding to ensure year over year we can continue to operate our programs. And so what are some potential mechanisms to do that? In some US states, they're implementing watercraft. There's a fee associated with watercraft registration. In some cases, there may be a sticker or a prevention pass that provides both an outreach opportunity, but also can provide, has a fee associated to help support the delivery of those programs. So again, trying to look at different mechanisms where in some jurisdictions they're already being implemented, and how could those transfer potentially over to other jurisdictions as well. And also different technologies. And so we'll hear about, a lot of the work that's being done so far. I mentioned that we have a standard protocol for inspection and decontamination. Even that is reviewed every several years to see how we need to adapt our decontamination protocols. We all know there's always new types of boats being developed, new technologies, even the capacity of engines change, and what's our ability to be able to decontaminate them as we get larger, more complex wakeboard boats, as an example. We're seeing electronics becoming involved with different types of boats, and this all requires us to adapt our protocols. And so there can be really important role for new technology, but we also want to make sure that we're aware of where there may be some limitations. And so as an example, I guess maybe eDNA isn't quite still emerging anymore. It's certainly been around for a few years now, and it's starting to become more of a routine tool being added to our monitoring programs. But it's really important that we understand both the strengths and limitations of any tool. And so that's where our collective coordination, we developed a consensus statement several years ago on how eDNA can be used as a tool. But a single positive eDNA detection wouldn't constitute a confirmation of invasive mussels or the presence of mussels in that system. It wouldn't trigger a full declaration of positive. What it would help do is identify areas where further monitoring is required. And so it's having that consensus approach is really important, because decisions to move forward on response, because we know water flows between jurisdictions, of course, impacts not only our own programs, but our neighboring jurisdictions when there are those new detections. And so standardizing how we're defining what those new detections are. Also, there's new tools being looked at for decontamination, an example being dip tanks that were first implemented in Utah at Lake Powell, where they were seeing really significant increases in the volumes of boats that were being used just for day use. And they were facing real challenges with the volume of boats they needed to decontaminate, in particular wakeboard boats. And so this tool was developed for that specific situation, where it provides a tool to decontaminate those types of boats. But it's very much complementary because while it does achieve that decontamination, it doesn't physically remove the mussels. So it still requires additional tools to complete the clean, drain, dry process. So it can very much be complementary to our existing tools in certain circumstances. And so that's where finding ways in, for example, the situation where in Lake Powell, they're doing exit decontaminations, and that's where it can be a valuable tool. And so I won't touch on canines because we have our expert here today, Cindy Sawchuk, to speak to the importance of them. But really, again, as we explore new tools, understanding how that can help strengthen our long-term goal. Next slide. And so talking so far largely about kind of our prevention tools, I do want to touch on quickly work that's equally important work that's happening on response kind of planning and preparedness. So over the years, through avenues like the Columbia River Basin, within our individual states and provinces, there's been the development of, for example, early detection, rapid response plans, developing tools in terms of what needs to be considered for a response within a system. Through the Western Basin, there's now a new online toolkit that's available that really goes through the different elements when looking at rapid response and things like containment. Over the years, I think probably coming up on probably over 2 decades now, that there's been annual tabletop exercises being done across jurisdictions. Because while we've developed these plans, it's equally important to be testing them and to understand what needs to go into the response. We'll hear examples of how those responses really do vary by individual water body and what those individual sites and some of the challenges that come with those. And so developing the tools to support response as well. And next slide. And we'll hear specifically today from Lloyd Knight about an example of where there really were some of those site-specific challenges and how those were addressed, and really the value of that response preparedness with the work that they've been doing in response in the Snake River. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully everyone can stay and learn about their experience there in the Snake River. Next slide. And I did want to quickly touch on, and I'm going to do my best to speak to this on behalf of Justin, because this is work that's largely been led through Washington. But we are also seeing, as the expansion is occurring and jurisdictions are now facing a situation of both prevention, but also containment, and the importance of trying to advance some of those containment technologies. Where this is important is looking at containment tools to isolate an aquatic invasive species once it's initially detected. That really is critical from a rapid response perspective. One of those initial steps is what can we do to contain while we're trying to assess what our options are, whether it's treatment or looking at different tools. Also, to help try to isolate a treatment. So trying to isolate that treatment to also protect if there are endangered or species at risk within those systems, allowing us to explore potentially different tools if we're able to contain that treatment area, and using tools to build that out. And also potentially expand where that treatment can occur. So can it potentially, through different containment tools, happen in faster flowing systems if there's the ability to use tools to contain the treatment, but then also allow the movement of species through. Next slide. And so some of the work that's being led right now through Washington State is looking at some different containment tools. In 2019, they did an exercise in Lake Roosevelt where they actually deployed some containment booms and looked at what it involves kind of firsthand on the ground to actually deploy this. So again, when I mentioned testing a plan, really actually going out and physically testing what it involves to actually use some of these tools. And so since then, they've continued this work. They've been partnering the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has been working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as well as the Washington Invasive Species Council. They've secured some funding and are doing work to look at different containment tools. So they actually did a global assessment of different containment tools. They hosted a webinar trying to build off of other sectors such as oil spill response, where some of these tools are quite routinely used, and how do we learn from those sectors, and trying to develop some new technologies that are specifically designed for aquatic invasive species. So they've secured some vendors to help build some customized tools for containment. So looking at different types of sort of containment nets, and actually having a separate vendor that would help with the deployment of the tools, because equally important is not only the actual like development of the technology, but I'm a biologist. I don't know how to deploy a containment net or boom, and there's a lot that goes into that. They're very site specific, and so they've been leading that work, and they're actually going to be conducting an exercise in November of this year, and are really encouraging that partners are welcome to attend. And they, again, this is an example of where we're really trying to learn from each other. And when we are, running these different types of exercises, we're always welcoming each other to attend and learn, and so that we're not reinventing the wheel, because these are all things that we can benefit from. So this is some really exciting work that will be happening later this year. So stay tuned for updates from Washington. And if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share Justin's contact information. I'm sure he's okay I said that, but he would be happy to connect with folks to talk about this work, because it's really of great interest, I think, for many of us across the region. So, and next slide. And wanted to touch on also, talked earlier about the impacts to infrastructure. There's also been a lot of great work being done across the region looking at infrastructure and mitigation, and some work that's been done specifically in BC. And we actually have the expert on this work here in the room, James Litley from the Okanagan Basin Water Board, who's been leading work in BC to develop a toolkit to look at how to develop mitigation tools for raw water infrastructure. And while it was designed kind of based out of BC, it's intended to be a tool that can be used more broadly across other areas. So if folks are interested to learn more about that, James is here today, so really recommend connecting with him to hear more about that work. Also across the Columbia River Basin, over the years, there's been a lot of work done looking at vulnerability assessments to hydro infrastructure. And so this map here, the outline is the Columbia River Basin. All the red points are facilities where vulnerability assessments have already been done. And so again, these are really important kind of proactive steps that are being taken across different sectors to look at what measures can be put in place should there be an introduction. So really good work to kind of look at how we can protect our infrastructure should there be an introduction. And then I think this is my last slide, and really just kind of want to plant the seed for, I think, what is going to be many more conversations throughout the day to really kind of look at how we continue to address the problem together, continuing to find ways to strengthen our coordination through existing forums, also continuing to mitigate the risks through our common goal, which is at the end of the day to achieve clean, during, dry. And we're going to hear about examples of how we're doing this and how we can look to adapt our programs over time, and how we balance our investments. And we're hearing, we're going to hear from both Manitoba and Idaho, who are facing balancing both prevention and containment. And what does that look like, and how we can support one another. I always say a stronger Manitoba, a stronger Saskatchewan, a stronger Alberta is a stronger BC, because we are all working together. We benefit from our collective efforts together. And so I just really I personally get the most out of these meetings and the opportunity to come together and talk about our work. And we always have to say glass half full, right, in our work. And I think that's where today is going to be a really great day, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, great job, Martina. Thank you very much. Is there any questions for Martina? Any questions at all? Okay. Just for the people online, we'll just use the microphone. How's that sound?
Just a comment in regards to transportation of barges across the country. And
Yeah.
I guess the Alberta example that Cindy and I know is, I guess, a gap between government departments in understanding the risk. And in our situation, we did have a barge that was coming out from Ontario, blew through all of the inspection stations right through to southern Alberta. That barge was being used by Transportation and Economic Corridors at Government of Alberta and got within about 5 feet of launching in one of our reservoirs. And Cindy can attest, it was um, probably 98% contaminated with live and dead mussels. So I think that we think about public education, and I think we also need to reflect about educating across departments in government to ensure that everyone understands the risk and ensures that there's a process in place to reduce that risk. Because we all know that there is limited infrastructure when it comes to barges and doing work in water. And some of that or most of that might be coming from Eastern Canada, where there's a big problem with invasive species. So just a comment so that everyone is aware, because I know we have some government people in the rooms across the provinces here.
No, that's a great comment. And that was my question was, what can we do as a government better to educate and inform the commercial sector? It seems like we're doing a pretty good job with the recreational users, but there seems to be a whole gamut of commercial and industrial applications. How can we do a better job of contacting and educating and informing that sector of our economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think great comment about working, strengthening not only across jurisdictions but within our own. And I'm glad you brought that up because I had intended to mention examples where we know that equipment, barges, are being moved for all types of water use. And it's not just recreationally, it's, whether it's infrastructure, there can be equipment related to our hydro partners in BC have measures in place at any time equipment for their hydro facilities are coming in. They're being checked to make sure that they're not coming from high risk areas. But absolutely, how do we, whether it's also for, transportation infrastructure or maintenance, there can be equipment being moved. And we know we see examples of this in the States where barges and other equipment are moved regularly. And so, there's initiatives like the call before you haul where we're trying to work with the haulers, but then there's also kind of the industry as well. So there can be multiple different groups that are involved with that movement of those equipment. And so it is absolutely ensuring how do we work with them, but then how can we also try to address it at the source, right? I mean, ideally, that's what we want to be seeing is that before these things are being moved, they're being cleaned. And so, I think at the end of the day, that would be the kind of gold star that we want to get to. And I think it's incrementally building that awareness and understanding for them what might be barriers that they're facing too, right? And I think, equally we're here to talk about, what are barriers for us, but when we're working with these industries, what are some of the barriers that they're experiencing? There's work happening through the 100th Meridian, the Columbia River, to do a survey. Now that call before you haul has been implemented for a few years, they're reaching out to haulers and saying what's working, what isn't. And so I think that's part of reflecting back on our programs too, is how can we work with these industries to, are the ways that we need to kind of adapt to help make sure that we're not unintentionally creating barriers for them. And so, like, obviously, we have to understand that there's key requirements that they need to follow, but how can we try to, whether it's better communicating out what those requirements are, can we better share that information? But absolutely, I think that's all part of how we have to evolve for sure. And I think that these types of equipment are only going to continue moving as we see more, infrastructure and work happening. We're only going to see some of these equipments, not just your, kind of canoes or kayaks or all that, but we're going to see other types of, I think, equipment and things continue to get moved more and more as well.
That's a great comment, Martina, because particularly many people in the realm that I work in and the Penwar region, I mean, a huge growing part of our global economy is that Asian, Trans-Pacific boundary is a tremendously growing part. And you're going to see a lot more from the eastern seaboard and less dependence on exporting to Europe and different nuances of infrastructure and industrial products moving to the west and, aiding the growth in the economy for the uh, southeastern region. Question from online. Next steps. What do we see as the future for some of the challenges and opportunities that are happening in the across the Columbia River Basin and British Columbia and Washington?
Oh my goodness, that's a big question. I don't think I can answer that alone. And I would say I think that's something that we want to spend the rest of today talking about is what are the next steps? My intent is to set the stage for what are going to be a lot of really great conversations. And I think that's something that I think is a great question to put in all of our minds now for us to think about throughout the rest of the day is how do we look at where we've come so far. And I think there's a lot of successes that we can build on and where are there areas that we can improve and refine. And so I think that's a great question for us to collectively think about. And by the end of the day, we're going to solve all the problems, right? Like that's all, of course, that's what we're going to do, but I can't do it alone. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Martina.